The courtroom had a certain energy today, different from the usual routine. The low hum of hushed conversations filled the space, with people shifting in their seats, anticipating the cases to come. Yet, as Judge Nathan Carter took his seat at the bench, his usual composed and unruffled demeanor betrayed no sign of the tumultuous events that were about to unfold. At the age of 52, Nathan was a man who had seen it all. His career had been defined by an unwavering commitment to justice, guided by a firm belief in logic, order, and precision. Emotions had no place in his courtroom, and neither did sentimentality. He had earned a reputation for his cool-headedness and decisiveness, traits that made him an ideal figure in the world of family court, a place where stories of loss, pain, and broken homes played out daily. For Nathan, each day in the courtroom was just another day at work. The cases were often tragic, turbulent families, custody battles, allegations of abuse, but they were nothing he hadn't seen before. His work was methodical. He had long ago learned to detach himself from the heartache that filled the courtrooms. It was a defense mechanism, something that allowed him to make tough decisions without being swayed by the emotions of the people before him. Family court was a place where emotions ran high, and it took all of Nathan's strength to keep his own emotions in check. Today, though, would be different. As he glanced over the docket, his eyes briefly paused on a name that felt out of place. Ella Brooks. The name seemed almost foreign to him. A 12-year-old girl, currently in foster care, with a history that looked nothing short of complicated. The words on the page spoke of a troubled past, multiple foster placements, allegations of neglect, behavioral issues escalating beyond control. Nathan had seen all of this before, countless times. There was nothing about this case that suggested it would be anything extraordinary. It was, at best, a routine hearing for another child caught in the system. But then the doors to the courtroom creaked open. A small, wiry girl entered, her dark curly hair framed around a face that, though young, held an air of maturity beyond her years. She was dressed in an oversized hoodie that hung loosely around her small frame, as though the garment was not meant for someone her size. Yet there was something about the way she carried herself, something about the way her sharp, intelligent eyes scanned the room, that commanded attention. There was a quiet confidence about her, a quiet strength that belied her age. She did not shy away from the gaze of anyone present, and her eyes lingered on Judge Carter for a long moment. It was as though she was sizing him up, assessing him, trying to make sense of the man who would hold her future in his hands. Then she spoke. "You're my dad." The words were simple, but they hit the room like a thunderclap. A stunned silence followed, one so thick it felt like the air had frozen. Even the stenographer's hands, poised over the keyboard, remained motionless. Nathan, too, found himself frozen. He blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly, or if perhaps this was some kind of strange joke. His mind raced, his pulse quickened. He had no idea who this girl was, and yet, the certainty in her voice left him feeling as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. The courtroom, usually filled with the murmurs of lawyers and plaintiffs, was now eerily silent, every eye on Nathan, waiting for him to respond. Nathan cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he did so, trying to regain his usual composure. "Excuse me," he asked, his voice shaky, tinged with disbelief. Ella did not flinch. Her eyes remained fixed on him, unwavering, as though her claim was the most obvious thing in the world. "I said," she repeated, her voice steady and unwavering, "You're my dad." Nathan felt his chest tighten. A strange sensation flooded his body, a mixture of confusion, fear, and something that felt dangerously close to panic. His heart raced, and for the first time in years, the walls he had so carefully built around his emotions began to crack. His mind scrambled for answers, for any shred of logic that would make sense of what was happening before him. Could it be true? Could this girl, this child, actually be his daughter? A flash of memory hit him then, unbidden and jarring. Maya. Her name echoed through his mind, as if it had been waiting for this moment to resurface. Maya Brooks. His mind flashed back to a time he had tried so desperately to forget. It had been years since he had thought about her. They had shared a brief, passionate romance when he was young, a romance that was everything he had never known he needed. Maya had been unlike anyone he had ever met. She was free-spirited, bold, and full of life. She had brought color into his otherwise black and white existence, challenging him to think beyond his rigid boundaries. But just as suddenly as she had come into his life, she had disappeared without explanation. No goodbye, no closure, just silence. Nathan had buried the memory, focusing all his energy on his career and avoiding the painful hole she had left in his heart. And now, all these years later, here was a girl standing before him, claiming to be his daughter. Could Ella be Maya's child? Could she really be his? Nathan blinked again, trying to steady himself. He glanced at the case file in front of him, his hands shaking slightly as he turned the page. He read the details again, trying to ground himself in the facts. But the words on the paper were no help. They only served to confuse him further. Ella Brooks, 12 years old, foster care, multiple placements. But there was nothing in the file to suggest any connection to Maya. And yet, the resemblance in the girl's eyes, in her mannerisms. Something about her was undeniably familiar. His breath caught in his throat as he realized the depth of the situation. What if this was true? What if this girl really was his daughter? How had he missed it all these years? The thought overwhelmed him, and for a moment, Nathan's normally calm and collected exterior cracked. The realization was too much to process in a single moment, and he found himself struggling to make sense of it all. The girl, Ella, stood there, her arms crossed in front of her, her posture still defiant. But there was something else there too. Vulnerability. A quiet hope, perhaps, that Nathan would believe her, that he would take her seriously. She had come here, to this courtroom, with a single declaration. "You're my dad." She was waiting for him to acknowledge her claim, to give her something to hold on to. Nathan took a deep breath, trying to gather his thoughts. He knew he needed to address this calmly, methodically, but his usual detachment had abandoned him. He looked at Ella, trying to read the truth in her eyes. "Miss Brooks," he said slowly, his voice still steady but now tinged with a hint of uncertainty. "This is a very serious claim you're making. Do you have any evidence to support it?" Ella hesitated, her gaze shifting briefly as she seemed to consider his words. Then she spoke again, her voice quiet but firm. "My mom used to talk about you," she said. "She didn't say much, but she called you Nathan. When I saw your name on the docket, I remembered her words." Nathan felt the ground shift again beneath him. Maya. Her name was tied to this girl in a way that he could not ignore. His mind raced as he processed the new information. Could it really be true? Had Maya kept this secret all these years? And if so, why? He glanced at the girl once more, her eyes now focused on the floor, her arms still crossed, but there was a quiet determination in her posture. Nathan knew this was no ordinary case. This was personal. This was a puzzle he had never expected to face, and now, it was one that would change his life forever. The courtroom seemed to grow even quieter, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Nathan stared at Ella, trying to process what had just been said. Her words echoed in his mind, leaving a dull, unnerving thrum in his chest. It felt as if the room itself had receded, and for the first time in years, Nathan felt small and uncertain. He had always prided himself on his ability to handle anything thrown his way in the courtroom, but now, standing here, facing a child who claimed to be his daughter, he felt completely out of his depth. He glanced at the other people in the room, the attorneys, the social workers, even the court clerk. Everyone had paused, their attention now fully fixed on him. They waited for him to speak, to act. But what was he supposed to do? What could he say? His mind was spinning in circles, unable to form any coherent thoughts. Ella's gaze remained fixed on him. It was as though she was daring him to deny her, to dismiss her as just another troubled child seeking attention. But Nathan could see something different in her eyes, a deep, unwavering resolve. She wasn't here for sympathy. She wasn't here for pity. She was here because she wanted to know the truth. And Nathan knew he had to give it to her, whether he was ready or not. Taking a slow breath, he adjusted his glasses, trying to collect his thoughts. He had dealt with countless complex cases, cases of children torn between broken homes, of parents who had failed them in unspeakable ways. But none of those had ever touched him in the way this one was. This wasn't just another child in foster care. This wasn't just another case to be decided on the basis of facts and law. This was personal. "Miss Brooks," Nathan began, his voice more controlled now, though still betraying a trace of uncertainty. "I need to understand. If you're truly my daughter, why was I never informed? Why didn't anyone tell me about you?" The words felt heavy in his mouth, as though each syllable carried the weight of years of unanswered questions. He had lived his life assuming that Maya's departure had been just another chapter in his past, one that was closed and forgotten. And yet here he was, with a child standing before him, who seemed to be the very product of that chapter. He could feel the walls he had so carefully built around his emotions begin to crumble, piece by piece. Ella didn't flinch at his question. Instead, she stepped forward, her movements deliberate, her eyes locked on his with an intensity that made Nathan uncomfortable. "My mom didn't want to tell you," she said, her voice soft but sharp, carrying the weight of an old grief. "She didn't want you to know. She thought it would only make things worse. She was scared, and she didn't think you'd believe her. And after she disappeared, there was no one left to tell you." Nathan's chest tightened. The words hit him harder than he had anticipated. He could hear the bitterness in Ella's voice, the pain of a child who had grown up with secrets, with unanswered questions of her own. He could feel the anger in her, the years of abandonment and confusion that had shaped her into who she was today. This wasn't just a girl claiming to be his daughter. This was a child who had lived through her own personal hell, who had been kept in the dark for far too long. A flood of memories rushed back to Nathan, the nights spent lying awake, wondering what had happened to Maya, wondering why she had left without a word. It had been the one wound he had never allowed to heal, the one question he had never been able to answer. And now, all these years later, it seemed as though Maya had made her own decision, one that had affected not only her life but the life of a child who was now standing in front of him, demanding answers. Nathan took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. "I didn't know," he said quietly, his voice almost lost in the stillness of the room. "I never knew about you, Ella. If I had, He stopped himself, unable to finish the sentence. How could he explain that? Had he known, he would have done things differently. How could he express the regret that was now flooding his heart, threatening to overwhelm him? He had been so focused on his career, so determined to build a life that was untouched by personal matters, that he had ignored the possibility that someone, had been missing from his life all along. Ella didn't give him the chance to say more. She turned away, her arms still crossed in front of her, a small but noticeable tremor running through her body. "I'm not here for apologies," she said, her voice low but firm. "I don't need your pity. I just want the truth. I want to know why you never looked for me." Her words stung, and Nathan could feel the weight of her accusation settle in the pit of his stomach. She was right. He had never looked for her. For all his efforts to control every aspect of his life, he had never once thought about the child that might have been his. He had never allowed himself to consider that the life he had built had a missing piece. But now, standing here, facing the consequences of his neglect, he realized how wrong he had been. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. It was as though the world around him had shifted, and now he was struggling to catch up. He had spent so much time building walls, avoiding personal connections, that he had lost sight of the very thing that had once mattered to him most. Love, family, the people who truly mattered. The truth, as painful as it was clear. Ella was his daughter, and despite everything he had built, despite all the years he had spent pushing away anything that might have caused him emotional turmoil, he couldn't ignore the reality that was now staring him in the face. "I'm sorry," Nathan said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The words felt inadequate, almost hollow, but they were all he could offer. He didn't know what else to say. He didn't know how to fix this, how to make up for all the years of absence. But he knew one thing. He couldn't walk away from this. Ella's eyes flickered briefly toward him, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the front of the room, where the court reporter was quietly typing away. The moment was over, but the weight of it remained. Nathan felt it pressing down on him, a heavy burden that he would carry for the rest of his life. The judge knew that his role here was clear. He had to continue the proceedings. But the path forward seemed uncertain. There were so many questions that remained unanswered, so many things that needed to be addressed. How would Nathan handle this revelation? How would he begin to repair the damage that had been done, not only to his own life but to Ella's as well? But as Nathan looked at the young girl standing before him, he realized that there was no easy answer. There was no simple fix to the pain and regret that they both shared. There was only the truth and the long, difficult road ahead. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. The air, once thick with formality, now felt charged with a raw, unsettling energy. Nathan's mind raced as he processed the staggering information that had just come to light. He had thought of himself as a man of logic, of reason, someone who could take any case, any challenge, and break it down into manageable pieces. But this was beyond reason. This was personal. This was family. He looked at Ella again, and for the first time, he allowed himself to truly see her. She was no longer just a claimant in a case. She wasn't a name on a piece of paper. She was a living, breathing person, standing in front of him, challenging the very foundation of everything he had known. The girl who stood before him was his daughter. There was no mistaking it now. The resemblance was undeniable. Her eyes, those eyes that were so much like his, seemed to pierce through him, exposing every corner of his mind. The eyes of a child who had spent years living with the weight of a secret, a child who had never been allowed the comfort of knowing where she came from, or who her real family was. But Nathan's heart sank as he realized the deeper truth. Ella wasn't the one who had kept herself in the dark. It had been him. For all his years of control, of perfectionism, he had been blind to the one thing that truly mattered. He had built his life on a foundation of power and professionalism, but at what cost? He had been so busy managing his career, his reputation, that he had never once considered the possibility that there could be more to his life than what he had already achieved. His breath hitched as he remembered Maya, the woman he had once loved, the woman who had disappeared from his life without a trace, leaving behind only questions and a deep, aching void. He had spent years trying to move on, to forget her, to bury the pain of her departure. But now, standing before him, was the consequence of that pain. The daughter he had never known, the daughter he had never tried to find. Nathan's mind was still reeling from the discovery. He had so many questions, so many things he needed to ask, but every word seemed to escape him, swallowed up by the enormity of what he had just learned. How could he have been so blind? How could he have gone all these years without knowing about her? Ella, too, seemed lost in her own thoughts. She stood there, arms still crossed, her face a mask of quiet anger and disbelief. The truth had been exposed, but there was no sense of relief, no sense of closure. If anything, it only added more layers of confusion and pain to an already fractured existence. "I don't want your apologies, Mr. Brooks," Ella finally spoke, her voice a quiet but unyielding force. "I don't want you to feel sorry for me. I don't want you to fix this. I just want the truth. I want to know why you never looked for me, why you never tried to find me." Her words were like a slap across Nathan's face. He had thought that he could keep his distance, that he could avoid confronting the past. But now, faced with the reality of his own daughter's pain, he realized just how wrong he had been. The truth was, Nathan had never really looked for her. He had never wanted to. The thought of reopening the door to his past, the past that was tied to Maya, had always terrified him. It was easier to bury the memories, to move forward with his life as if that chapter never existed. But now, standing before him, was the painful evidence of what he had chosen to ignore. Ella's words stung. They were sharp, cutting through the carefully constructed armor Nathan had built around himself. He wanted to argue, to justify his actions, but he knew deep down that there was no excuse, no reason that could make this right. He had failed her. He had failed them both. The courtroom, which had been so tense just moments before, now felt like a silent, suffocating space. Nathan's thoughts raced, but his body remained still, as though frozen in place by the enormity of the moment. He glanced at the judge, who, too, seemed to be processing the complexity of the situation. The judge's eyes flickered briefly over to the social worker, as if seeking some sort of guidance, but there was none to be had. The legal proceedings had been interrupted by something far more significant than any courtroom drama. Ella continued, her voice now tinged with bitterness. I had to grow up without a father. I had to grow up not knowing who I was. And now, after all this time, you're just going to act like you can make it all better with some words? With some apology? She shook her head, her jaw tightening as she tried to hold back the tears that were threatening to spill. Nathan felt a lump form in his throat, but he didn't speak. There were no words that could fix this. There was nothing he could say that would make Ella feel better. He had missed too much. He had allowed too much time to pass. And now, the damage had been done. I don't expect anything from you, Ella went on, her voice steadier now, but still filled with the weight of all the years she had spent carrying this burden. I don't want your money. I don't want your pity. All I want is for you to admit the truth, to admit that you were wrong. And maybe, just maybe, we can start to figure out what happens next. Nathan swallowed hard. The truth was there, hanging in the air between them, as clear and undeniable as the bond they now shared. There was no running from it. There was no pretending it didn't exist. He had a daughter. He had a daughter who had spent years living without him, who had grown up in a world that was missing a father's love and guidance. And no matter how hard he tried to distance himself from the past had found him. For the first time in his life, Nathan didn't know what to do. His hands, which had always been steady and sure, trembled slightly as he clasped them together in his lap. How could he fix this? How could he repair the damage that had been done, not just to his own life, but to Ella's as well? He turned his gaze to Ella, meeting her eyes one last time. She wasn't looking for an answer from him right now. She wasn't looking for him to fix everything. She was looking for something simpler, something he could give her. The truth. And Nathan knew, with painful clarity, that it was the one thing he could never take back. The years lost could never be regained. But perhaps, just perhaps, the future was still in his hands.